Good evening. The opinions and statements voiced by our guests do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this network. Enjoy the shows.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, Birmingham, Alabama.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
Now, historic films made in the spring of 1948 and just released show Eniwetok preparing for heavily guarded and still largely secret tests of new atomic weapons. The test's purpose is to measure atomic effects on thousands of different materials, 30,000 tons of them, not, as at Bikini, to prove military effectiveness.
San Francisco police say that 9 persons have been arrested in a narcotics raid on the headquarters of the Grateful Dead, a widely popular singing group. 2 members of the group, Rod McKernan and Robert Weir, and their business manager, Danny Rifkin, have been booked on suspicion of possessing narcotics.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, strange lights are causing a viral buzz on YouTube. Could we have caught extraterrestrial activity on a recent newscast? Brandon Arroyo investigates.
As the newscast ended, the controversy began back on September 26th. What is that light shining in the back of the dark night sky?
With coverage reaching all the way back to 1948, for over 70 years, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Now, Fate Magazine Radio is carrying on that tradition of setting the standard in paranormal talk radio as we report and discuss some of the most mysterious and perplexing phenomena imaginable in this strange world of ours. Now, here is your host of Fate Magazine Radio, Kat Hobson.
Good evening. Welcome to WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. You are listening to Fate Mag Radio, the online voice of Fate Magazine. I am Kat Hobson, your host, and I am so glad to welcome you because tonight is going to be a fantastic show. I appreciate very much everyone's support with me, for me and with me through my mother's illness. I don't want to be amiss in letting y'all know how much that meant to me. It still does. You know, I get people checking on me and just making sure that I'm still rocking and rolling, doing the research, doing the work, and I am. But I just want to say thanks. And that's that. Now, tonight's guest, Dave Marler, is just a brilliant UFO researcher. He has one of, if not the largest UFO libraries relevant to the history from the past 75 years. His website is http://davidmarler, M-A-R-L-E-R, UFO.com. And you need to check it out because, man, you want to talk about a rabbit hole? We are talking about a rabbit hole. It's awesome. It's interesting. There are so many possibilities for learning yourself There are audio files that go back for ages. There are, and from more across the world, all around the world. I was really enjoying one from New Zealand earlier, and they include reports from law officers and news reporters. Primarily, though, I think my favorite are the ones that are just the average person who has no idea what that was, why that was, but know that it was. So, David Marler, I am so excited to welcome you to Fate. How are you?
I'm doing great, Kat, and I really appreciate this invitation. And I have to tell you, it warms my heart to hear someone enjoying those vintage audio recordings. I've put a lot of man hours into acquiring these essentially reel-to-reel audio recordings and then digitizing those over about an 8-9 month period, not only digitizing, but digitally remastering, making them better than the original recordings themselves. And to your point, you know, they span the globe. That's one of my favorites that you mentioned from New Zealand. And they go back as early as, I believe, the earliest recording that I've done in the last year is from 1957. So certainly chronicling the history of the UFO phenomenon. And I was remarking to my wife when I was working on these, I said, what's so fascinating about these recordings, especially those going back that far, these quite literally may be the only recordings that exist of some of these rare interviews, radio shows, etc. And so to be able to preserve it is obviously a treat as a UFO historian, but to hear you finding enjoyment and education in listening to those old recordings. And on my website, I must preface for anybody that goes there, it's only a sampling of what I've done. I've digitized 221 historic audio recordings just in the last year and a half. And I just acquired about 2 weeks ago another 200 recordings. And so it's just perpetual work as I acquire more historical data, trying to digitize it, make it accessible to the public, not only the public, but also researchers. That's really one of the things I love about capturing all of this information, is sharing it with researchers to help further their research endeavors.
Well, I started out focused on the paranormal, ghosts and things that go bump in the night and why they're there, how are they there, what are they? And as I have gone through that, I'm finding more and more often that anomalous topics seem to be merging together somewhat.
Yes.
There's rarely just one involved in any given situation.
I agree. That's been my experience. I have a dear friend who's had lifelong experiences, both her and her family. I know these people quite well, trust them implicitly, and they've never sought publicity. I want to add that for any skeptics or cynics out there that question everyone that comes up with these claims. The nature of her experiences, you could relegate to the abduction/experiencer category. However, they've also had poltergeist activity, as many people have that have had experiences, lifelong experiences, entity sightings. And by that, I mean not alien, but something that you would probably put into the category of ghosts or vaporous apparitions. So it's interesting. Before we went on, you and I were discussing a friend of mine, John Alexander, and John in his lectures, I think really kind of typifies what we're talking about, because he states that in his worldwide travels with various indigenous populations, in addition to Native American tribes here in the United States, John makes a very important point. He states, whereas with our Western mindset, our scientific Western mindset, we tend to put things in boxes and categorize them. He said, when you talk to these indigenous cultures, there is no normal paranormal. He said it's a spectrum of reality where all of these things lie. It's on a spectrum, and there aren't these dividing categories of normal, paranormal, ghosts, UFOs, etc. And so it's interesting. He goes, we tend to kind of create our own mental boxes to put these things in, but they view it as this vast, diverse spectrum of life, for lack of a better term. It's just part of life.
Well, it is. And if people are experiencing any of those things, they are going to generally find that it's a little more broad than they think. And I have had clients who just couldn't believe that these things could be correlated.
Oh, absolutely. And Kat, I'm sure you've had this experience, as I have, as many of your audience that's listening probably have, where you knew someone, they were a staunch skeptic with all things paranormal until they had a sighting of a ghost, until they had a sighting of a UFO. And suddenly their skepticism is quickly eroding because they can't fit their experience into this very, very narrow framework of reality. And as I like to say, with each passing day, with each passing week and month, we have people, for lack of a better term, converting to a believer, if I can use that term.
You can use that term.
Because simply because, you know, people are constantly having UFO sightings. People are constantly experiencing, for lack of a better term, elements of the paranormal, as we would call it. And so with each passing year, and some people say this UFO stuff, this ghost stuff never goes away. Well, it doesn't go away because the phenomenon isn't going away. And quite the contrary, more people with each passing year are having experiences of one nature or another.
Do you find it interesting, I do, that the UFO topic went from being considered almost a junk science to all of a sudden it is so mainstream? It's like chic to have had an experience. It's like, you know, you're very, very cool if you're up on the terminology and if you know who, well, we'll say Lou Elizondo or
Sure.
Chris or,
Sure.
but it's gone from being a mocked kind of thing to being one of the hottest topics in the world right now.
Absolutely. And, you know, we have to chalk that up to Lou and Chris, who really, you know, lobbied behind the scenes on Capitol Hill to try to get this recognized. And, you know, I'd love to touch on this in multiple facets because it's such a fascinating time, to your point right now, in ufology. Again, I've been doing this for 32 years, and I've been struggling to try to present and frame the UFO discussion in a very serious light. And I think I've done a good job of that, but certainly nothing to the degree that Chris and Lou have done in really shedding the worldwide spotlight, to be quite honest, on the subject. And to garner government and military officials to seriously look at the subject, and beyond looking at the subject, because certainly they did that to some degree with Air Force Project Blue Book in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but we know what their conclusions were.
Right.
Today, with the Pentagon UAP report as of last year, whether you believe in UFOs or not, and I've been saying this in the last year in lectures and on various podcasts, it doesn't matter if you believe in UFOs or not. The fact of the matter is we now have the official stamp of approval on the part of the United States government stating whatever this is, the phenomenon is real.
Well, and, you know, we're actually slow to the game because,
Very slow.
Because Canada, Chile, well, a lot of South American countries.
Yes.
The UK. There's so many other nations who have acknowledged this, released their own files, shared with the public because they trust the public not to go into a rampage panic. And, you know, it's been being talked about openly for years, decades.
Absolutely. I would throw one other country in, Belgium, when they had the famous Belgian wave. General de Brouwer, then Colonel de Brouwer, was making public statements that we have objects in our airspace that are beyond our control. I mean, that was for the time. And I believe he made that statement either in 90 or 91. I'd have to go back and I can't remember the exact date of the press conference. That was a pivotal point in time for a colonel, again, later general, to make statements like that. And as you and your audience may recall, they also released the radar data of the F-16 locking onto this unidentified object. And so that really caught my attention. And that's one of the reasons that I started really looking into the triangular UFO phenomenon. But to your point, many of the South American countries were leading the charge with regard to taking this seriously. and taking it seriously in I think, a very pragmatic way. The Chilean officials were stating that we're simply looking at this, at the very least, from the practicality of air safety. If we have commercial airliners flying with passengers in our airspace, and we say it's controlled, yet we have these unidentified objects moving with impunity, not only in commercial air corridors, but in military air corridors, this poses a potential threat to air safety. And I would completely agree. Last February, before the Pentagon UAP report came out here in New Mexico, on February 21st, 2021, an American airline pilot and co-pilot saw a cylindrical object nearly collide with their aircraft, not very far from where I live here in Albuquerque, up in the northeast sector of the state. And within actually less than 24 hours, I filed a FOIA request. I got delay after delay after delay. And finally, myself, along with John Greenwood and a number of other UFO researchers who had filed the same FOIA request, eventually we all received basically I won't call it a rejection letter, more of a denial letter that if we had any information, we can't divulge it because it may impact, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, it may impact federal investigations that may or may not be conducted at this time. It was the most double talk I've ever read in a FOIA request response. But
the government at its finest.
The government at its finest. But the point is, though, I mean, obviously we continue to have these, near misses with these unidentified objects. And even the Navy spokesman, if you recall, in 2019, after obviously the DoD videos had been released and there was a lot of interest that was, continuing to build, the Navy spokesman stated that they were formulating official policy and procedures for naval personnel. And many people seized on that part. But what I noticed was the secondary statement. The reason they were doing this was due to the increased frequency of UAP sightings near and around sensitive military operations areas. That, I thought, was a very telling statement.
Absolutely it is. It's the reason that we're able to talk about it now with a fair amount of impunity.
Absolutely. And so to your point, I think for the younger people coming into the subject, and by that I mean just in the last few years, post New York Times article, December 2017, I don't think people fully appreciate that this has been a historic game-changing moment with regard to the subject and the U.S. government's position on the subject. For the first time, we have the official seal of approval that, yes, these things are there. We don't know what they are. And, they are investigating them. Now, I know people thought we were going to have disclosure with a capital D. As early as January 2021, I was on live Russian television news, and they wanted to ask me what my opinion was of the subject. And I remember reaching out to Chris Mellon to get his thoughts on it. I said, I'm getting ready to go on live Russian television news tonight, Chris. I said, this is what I was going to say. What do you think? Do you think I'm in line, or do you think I'm completely off base? And basically what I stated, and it's still online. I think there's a link on my website still.
There is, but it's in Russian.
Okay, good. I couldn't remember if I still had it on there or not. But I stated that I think we need to temper our expectations accordingly. I think the people that were disappointed when the report came out set their expectations too high. I mean, there were literally people that I talked to that thought they were going to wheel out the crashed UFO from 1947 and dead alien bodies. And I just simply stated, and I don't say it arbitrarily, I said, based on the decades long worth of denials on the part of various agencies within the U.S. military and intelligence community, I don't think that they're going to go that much about face. Now, I think they may acknowledge there's something there, which they did. But as far as detail and substance, I wasn't getting my hopes up, which, again, for those that know and have read the report, there's not much substance there.
There is not.
But it is an official acknowledgement of the phenomenon, and that in and of itself is a game-changing moment in the field.
Well, it is, and we're about to have to go to our first break, but when we come back, I would like to continue that thought, because for the government to actually acknowledge that this is even a real phenomenon, our government, was just astounding. And people are just so ill because it's not, more clearly stated. But if you just knew, this is wonderful. So, but we'll be back after this break, and thank you all so much for listening. And I am sure y'all are going to have questions. You're welcome to join us in the chat room and pop them in there, or you can just message me, and I'll make sure we get them in. Thanks. We'll be right back.
Warning, the following message does not necessarily reflect the views of WBHM-DB or its hosts, guests, listeners, or of any functioning adult in general. In fact, Frank should probably seek professional help. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi there, Frank Lee here. I thought that I would spend a few moments telling you about the positivity from the network here. The overall message of para-unity and happiness, and how everyone here wants to get along with everyone out there, and how everything is just wonderful. Wait, Cat's not looking. Okay, I've got something to really tell you. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what's really going on. Honestly, all that being nice and positive crap was kind of hurting my soul, as dark as it is. So, what's really happening? You see it all the time. Everybody and their brother out there has a paranormal team because they watched a couple of episodes of Ghost Hunters or some crap like that. So they go and they spend half their mortgage payment on tools and things that light up that they don't understand. And then the next logical step, after buying matching black t-shirts and posing like 90s rappers for their Facebook page, is to, of course, have their own podcast. Well, you know what? You're not going to find that crap here. What we have here at WBHM Digital Broadcasting is the best host, the best guest, bringing you real information. All of the hosts here on this network know their stuff. They are the people who have been out there doing the work, doing actual research. And no, by research, I don't mean binge watching some kind of cheesy TV show on Netflix. I mean reading books. I mean out in the field doing the legwork. And who are they interviewing on their shows? They're bringing you the people they have learned from. They're bringing you the best in the field, covering all kinds of topics, from UFOs and aliens to Bigfoot to cryptozoology to ghosts to anything you can think of, a bit strange and unexplained. It is here, and you're going to get the best information here. So stay tuned to WBHM Digital Broadcasting. Don't go anywhere. Speaking of going somewhere, I've got to go before my mic gets cut. We'll see you there on WBHM-DB.
Welcome back to Fate Mag Radio, the online voice of Fate Magazine, and I'm so excited to be back, yay, and also to be with my guest, David Marler. And do be sure to check out his website. It is www.davidmarlerufo.com. There is so much information there, and I'm going to tell you, it's a rabbit hole. You will not be able to put it down for long, and I have had a couple of late nights just going through some of that audio and reading all the things that I can. I did not realize, David, when we set this up, just how really interesting everything is.
Well, I'm gratified to hear that. I'm a history nerd beyond UFOs, but obviously within the UFO field, I've kind of cut out my little niche as one of the UFO historians in the field, and not only a historian but an archivist. That you can be a historian but not necessarily physically personally acquire a lot of historical items. Yes. But I always kind of it seems like I'm parsing words there, but I'm a historian but also an archivist. And I just during COVID, just in the last year, having worked closely with the Center for UFO Studies, became a board member. They invited me to be a board member. They don't have many of these open up, but they asked, since I was already maintaining the files, which I'll talk about here briefly, they asked if I would be their official archivist, which I'm very happy to serve in that role. And of course, Dr. J. Allen Hynek founded CUFOS back in 1973. And quite literally sitting next to me right now as we're speaking, I have 15 file cabinets filled with the largest historical UFO case file collection in the world. These include the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, the NICAP files from Donald Kehoe's era and Richard Hall. We also have Dr. J. Allen Hynek's Center for UFO Studies case file collection, a group that maybe people aren't familiar with unless you're really a history nerd like myself, is the group called CSI New York, which stood for Civilian Saucer Intelligence. And that was Ted Blocher, Lex Mebane, and Isabel Davis. And they were three of the very early pioneers in the UFO field. And before I forget, Kat, I always like to mention, beyond preserving the material, I think it's important in that process to remember these individuals that we're talking about, the people that were truly pioneers for where we are today. If they didn't do half the work they did, we might not be where we are with regard to the history, the chronicling of the history, and looking at this phenomenon the way we are. I only wish, going back to our first segment, they could have, many of these people who are now passed, could have lived to see the day where the government officially acknowledged the phenomenon.
Absolutely. And, it's really ridiculous how these individuals were treated.
Yes.
By so many different agencies of our government. Yeah,
and Don Kehoe, who's one of my favorites, I always call him the pit bull of ufology, because he went toe-to-toe with the Air Force and the Air Force spokesman. And, he was certainly a force to be reckoned with in many respects.
Well, I am just amazed at the volume of work that you have. It's just something that interests me, and a lot of people would disagree with me on this, but I'll stand by it every day, is that, we have already had disclosure in the fact that Blue Book was a government study.
Sure.
And Blue Book acknowledged that there were cases in there that were unexplained. They couldn't explain them. They had everybody in avionics, every engineer, attempting to get this right. It was obviously not a weather balloon at Roswell. They don't tend to scrape up the ground and leave messes. But, there is so much information in Blue Book that was unexplained by any expert on the planet. And every one of them had a shot.
Absolutely. Despite the fact that they tried to dispel the subject in the public mindset and discount some cases, to your point, there still was that residual body of cases that they couldn't explain away. And I will share with you and your audience, one of the joys that I have in archiving Dr. Hynek's original Project Blue Book material, which I failed to mention is also part of the CUFOS case file collection, is going through his original government documents, his original Project Blue Book documents, going back to the early days of the project. And contrary to what many people hear, that later in life he's had this erosion of skepticism, and he really came around recognizing there was a genuine phenomenon. Kat, I'm here to tell you, even in the early mid 50s, there were cases where, and again, I have the files here where I can literally hold and read them, where you will see Dr. Hynek, who typically would always use a red felt marker or pen for his notations on these. You can see the official Air Force explanation. In fact, one said ball lightning. He crossed it out 3 times. Underneath wrote unidentified in uppercase letters and underlined it 3 times. And then in addition to things like that, you would see interesting little marginalia. He would write things to the effect, why didn't AF, Air Force, he would always abbreviate Air Force with AF, why didn't AF investigators obtain radar data in this case? Why didn't AF investigators interview second pilot in this case? So even in the early days, you could see the consternation that Hynek had in dealing with the military and their lax ability in many cases to thoroughly investigate these cases to the extent that they should have been.
Well, I don't think it was a lack of ability to investigate them.
Maybe a lack of will.
A lack of the ability to get those stars, but or birds. But it was. I mean, it was kind of. I mean, it. In my mind, that has always been the first disclosure. Yeah. To say there's, what is it, 968 that are unexplained.
Officially 701 is the official record.
Okay. But I saw the other number somewhere, and I thought that's a lot of cases.
Yes,
but,
700.
But the 700 is a lot.
Yeah, 701 was an extremely conservative number, and I can't remember if it was Don Berliner or one of the other senior researchers in the field that went through and really reviewed all of the cases. And to your point, it was more, I think, in the neighborhood of 900 and something that was truly unidentified. In other words, ones that weren't arbitrarily explained away.
Yes. And I just think that's interesting because nobody ever acknowledges Hynek's work as being that.
Well, you're absolutely right. People are very discriminatory when you bring up Project Blue Book. The initial knee-jerk response is, well, we knew that was just a cover and that they really weren't investigating this stuff and Blue Book was just a charade. Okay, I always simply state this. In writing my book and in continuing to do my research, I'm constantly going back to the Blue Book data sets because there's a lot of cases there. As I always say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The reports by military and civilian individuals, both here in the United States as well as international reports that they acquired, are valid data points. You can't just summarily discount it. What I tell people is when you review these, and I've had a number of researchers physically come here to do research on the Blue Book material since I've had it moved here. If you're going through the Blue Book material, read the case file. Just ignore the section at the very end that says conclusions. You don't have to agree with the Air Force, but the data that resides within those case files are very important.
Well, I tell you, if I ever get your way,
you need to come out, Kat.
I'm going to come.
You need to come out here.
Well, we are working on that. I have not been to New Mexico except just through Four Corners. And yes. I'm due.
Yeah, well,
and due to get there.
Before I forget, not only are we acquiring all of this historical material, and I have it here in my research center in New Mexico, but what we're ultimately trying to do, and I always sometimes forget to mention this, I understand people can't necessarily physically come to Albuquerque to see the actual materials, although I have a lot of foot traffic through here with researchers, interested individuals, as well as production companies, which I provided the material to help assist with telling the history of the subject. But our ultimate goal, and I keep saying we and our, I'm referencing Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldridge, who are two of the leading historians on the UFO subject, who were inspirations to me when I first got involved. Now we're colleagues and good friends. But what we're trying to do is to work with the Center for UFO Studies to eventually get all of this material. You referenced the audio recordings, the case files, the photographs, the slides, the microfilm that we have, to eventually get all of that material digitized and uploaded to a virtual archive site, where people worldwide can readily access the information. And I must add this part, because unfortunately, like every field, we have people that are trying to monetize things and make a living off it. We want to do it free of charge. It's not with the intent of charging access to it. We believe the information belongs to everybody, completely, free of charge. So that's the ultimate goal. It's going to be years to get there, but we're slowly working on that by digitizing the files. Last September, Barry Greenwood, Jan Aldridge came out to my home. My wife and I and my family opened up our house. They literally lived with my family for 2 straight weeks. And during that time, morning, noon, and night, they were sitting here in the research room scanning all of these historic case files. they made a pretty good dent in it, and they've done work previously to work on this. But during that 2-week period alone, they were able to scan 33,000 pages of documents.
Holy cow.
But it's just a small drop in the bucket compared to the vast quantities of material that are not only here representing the CUFOS case file, but I have about 15 drawers full of historical UFO materials as well from various researchers and collections that I've acquired over time. In fact, right before we went on air, I was sent a message that someone has a rare historic collection of UFO material. And I just messaged the individual just to kind of inquire, could we maybe talk and learn a little bit more about your collection? So I always like to say people come in here, and like James Fox, for example, for his documentary, The Phenomenon. James came here back in 2017, and it was so funny. The cameraman and I were laughing because James kept opening file cabinets and pulling stuff out. And the best analogy I can give you, Kat, it was like a kid on Christmas opening one present after another. He's like, oh my God, you have this photo? We have to use this.
I can see that.
You have this audio recording. And for those that have met and know James, and I say this with total respect because I love the man dearly. He's a good friend. He just has this enthusiasm that's like a toddler. It's like he's looking at all this stuff just with wonder through his eyes. And he kept pulling out case files and photographs and sketches and government documents. And the cameraman and I were just laughing hysterically because he was just on this emotional high in looking at all this historical material. And one of the best compliments I ever received was from James. He's told me repeatedly, both publicly on interviews as well as just privately, he goes, I quite literally could not have made the first hour of my documentary without your archive and your historical materials. And again, which included visual elements, but also audio recordings like we were discussing earlier, Kat.
Well, I tell you, I can see that. I can see someone just having such joy and fascination and wonder that all of that is in one location because it's been denied for so long.
Yes, and unfortunately, and I hate to bring this up, unfortunately, there have been some significant UFO research collections that wound up in a landfill where researchers died, and either us fellow researchers knew they passed, but wanted to give the family, obviously, a time to grieve. There's a time for everything. And so when a family member passes, you want to give them, a wide berth so they can grieve and come to terms with things emotionally and so forth. And then later we would reach out to the family. And in some cases, in many cases, they would state, well, our uncle was into that UFO stuff. Nobody in the family was, so we threw it all in the trash.
That would be heartbreaking.
And I can't tell you how many collections have been lost like that. So the ones that I acquire, and real quick, just one little anecdote I'll share with you and the audience. One collection I obtained quite literally came from a self-proclaimed dumpster diver in New York State.
Oh my gosh.
It's been a number of years now, and I acquired 3 or 4 collections in rapid succession. So I can't remember the exact time frame, but it was some years back. And a mutual friend somehow put us in touch with each other. And it started as with anything, Kat, as I'm sure you and your audience can appreciate. We started with emails, then we shared phone numbers, we started talking, then we started Skyping, and one thing led to another. And long story short, he was going through this dumpster on a regular basis because he obviously deduced that whoever was throwing the stuff in the trash must have been related to this individual. He was finding all of this historic material going back to 1947 regarding the UFO subject.
Oh my gosh.
Rare letters and correspondence with people like Kenneth Arnold, people like, I'm trying to think now, Gray Barker, one of the early researchers.
Yes.
James Mosley. It was a who's who of ufology circa 1947 to about 1965, 1966. Long story short, we started talking about this, and I made him an offer, and he accepted it. So he shipped it all out to me. And what it was the personal effects and personal correspondence of Dr. Leon Davidson, who was an early UFO researcher, who was a mainstream scientist. He worked on the Manhattan Project and actually was here in New Mexico working on the Manhattan Project for a number of years. Ostensibly, his whole collection went to the Columbia University in New York State. But if you look at their online inventory, they have nothing with regard to personal correspondence or personal effects. It's all books and journals and things that many collectors already have. So I was, to use my UK friend's term, which I love, I was gobsmacked when I started going through this material and seeing the personal letters. And this is what's so beautiful, Kat. When you get these old collections of correspondence, as you can appreciate, they were typewritten letters, sometimes handwritten letters. But when Dr. Davidson would reach out to someone, he would keep a carbon copy of the letter that he sent. And then I would have the letter of response. And then quite often it might be a series of letters where he wrote another letter, but he kept the carbon copy. So the point is, when you have this historic correspondence and you have the carbon copies of letters that were sent, you have a continual dialogue. You get to see the questions he asked, what he was saying. You get to see the response of the individual, and so on and so on. So
how he was being fed, his brain was being fed to come to fabulous conclusions based on empirical evidence.
Absolutely,
and experience. That's fantastic.
And this was like I said, a gentleman that worked on the Manhattan Project and did a lot for our country in many different respects. And in his personal effects, I actually have his high school diploma. I have a certificate that was given to him by the War Department for his efforts working on the Manhattan Project, and a number of other personal effects. And these were literally in a trash dumpster. And if it wasn't for this dumpster diver who I was put in touch with, that information would have been lost. The correspondence between him and Kenneth Arnold and all these other early pioneers and researchers in the field would have been lost. I mean, quite literally, these are unique, one-of-a-kind items. And again, that's a success story, but we have many stories where we lost collections as a result of time and not knowing that the individual died or the family didn't know where to direct that material. And but luckily, I in my efforts, I've been trying to preserve as much of that as possible. And even beyond UFOs, Kat, I've always felt that whatever subject you're studying, if you don't know your history, you have no context for what you're looking at today. And certainly 2022, I mean, this is a big year.
Yes, it is.
75th anniversary of the modern age of UFOs with, of course, Kenneth Arnold's sighting and Roswell in 1947. And I'm happy I'll be speaking actually at Roswell in July for the 75th anniversary. They asked if I would come and attend that, and I'm looking forward to that. But also looking forward to another conference that I'll be seeing you at in Eureka Springs next month.
I'm very excited about that. That is we were discussing, that is a fantastic conference.
One of the best.
And they bring in people like you who are just so well informed and have a love for this topic as well as a deep respect for it. And I was fortunate enough to know Stanton Friedman through conversations and interviews, but I didn't meet him until I was at Ozark.
Yep.
And it was just like, I need a hug. Pre-COVID, I need a hug.
And Kat, something that I'm sure you'll agree with at these conferences, whether it's Eureka Springs or otherwise, I always tell people, yes, you learn a lot from the lecturers. You learn a lot from the lectures that are being presented. Mm-hmm. But I said, stay up late and go to hotel rooms and hang out in the halls, because the people that you meet are incredible. The experiences that they've had, the research that they've done, you don't have to be on stage to be a credible researcher. Many researchers don't want to even be on stage, but they've done fantastic research. And so, yes, I hope you learn something in the lecture hall, but you learn so much more by just interacting with all of the other attendees from various parts of the country.
Absolutely. But we have to take a quick break. And I am just, to coin your phrase, gobsmacked by some of this information. But we'll be right back. Y'all come back too.
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio. broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but... Nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experienced Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Welcome back. I am so glad y'all are listening, and I hope you're enjoying this nearly as much as I am. My guest tonight is fantastic. We are having such a great time, and I have to tell you, Mark, that this is just, I can't believe I did that, but I am so excited. Just, are you going to just laugh at that, David?
No,
I went to your last name instead of your first name. So
actually, they called me that in high school, so that's all right.
Oh, that's true. That's true. But I am just really enjoying this conversation.
Well, like I said, this is a great year to be talking about the history of the subject, and I've got a whole new lecture I'll be presenting really across the country. I've been fortunate enough, now that COVID is starting to ease up, It looks like we're going to start having in-person events again, which I think I speak for all of us on this discussion and the audience, that, you know, we're certainly looking to see real people again and not do virtual meetings. And so I'm really excited to kind of see a lot of familiar faces, see a lot of new faces. You know, since really COVID hit, I will tell you, Kat, that even though I've been doing this for a long time, I've had some wonderful opportunities. You know, James Fox's The Phenomenon came out, which generated a lot of interest in the history and some of my research and my archives. Ross Coulthart in Australia did a fantastic documentary, in my opinion. And I'm very critical of productions, I will tell you. But Ross Coulthart did a great documentary for Australian television. I looked on YouTube at their site, and just the other day, I was just curious, and I was shocked to see over 12 million people have viewed that documentary. And I think in large part due to that, but also James Fox's documentary, as well as, before I forget, the Unidentified episode I participated in for the History Channel about a year or two ago. The emails, the volume of emails that I've been receiving worldwide have just astounded me. I mean, I quite literally can't keep up with the email volume, and I'll apologize to you, Kat. I think you may have reached out a couple of times trying to get this show lined up, and I apologize. But, you know, as I always tell audiences, I don't do UFOs for a living, although I would love to. I have a full-time job career, I have a family, and I do UFOs as kind of a secondary job. I don't call it a hobby because that, I think, diminishes the amount of work and money and time I've put into it.
Too.
But it's just been tremendous. You know, I don't care to do many productions, but they do serve a purpose. It does get your name out there. It does facilitate people from all walks of life, from all over the globe, quite literally, reaching out. I had a gentleman this one really put a smile on my face. He just messaged me through Facebook, and he said, David, he goes, I'm watching you on television now here in Rome, And it was a gentleman who lived in Rome, Italy, and he took a picture of me on one of those documentaries. And I just thought that was so funny, just to have someone from Rome, Italy reach out to me and just share that message.
I think that's neat.
It's just, and I will also say that a number of researchers, not just individuals or interested parties, enthusiasts, but hardcore researchers from various countries have reached out. I'll be doing a virtual presentation later this year for a group in Brazil. And there'll be not only Brazilian UFO researchers, but a researcher, my friend Philip Mantle from the UK, representing the
United Fabulous.
Representing United Kingdom, and we'll also have Chris Rakowski from Canada. Mm-hmm. We have an individual from Portugal, and I'm trying to think of the other country. It might be Chile, but the point is, it's just wonderful when we can have that international dialogue, because admittedly, either by happenstance or just by limitations due to money, time, some of us kind of have a parochial mindset. We're only interested in UFOs in our state, in our country, but admittedly, it's a global phenomenon. So to have that international dialogue with researchers across the globe, I think that's bodes well for us to try to come to terms, or at least come close to maybe trying to define or create the framework for what we're dealing with this UFO subject.
Well, I tell you that the first three are people I'm familiar with, you, Chris, and Philip. Mm-hmm. And if the others are that caliber, then that's going to be one heck of a conversation.
Absolutely. And again, I like to focus on UFO history, but I admit, I can see that that's only one element. Other researchers are doing great things. Eureka Springs, just going back to the conference that you and I will be attending here in about a month. I think one of the great successes of that conference is they bring researchers who are focused on different elements or aspects mm-hmm. of the phenomenon. And so I think that the audience, whether you like my lecture or not, doesn't matter. But when you come away from that weekend of hearing all of these lectures, I think you get a well-rounded representation of the field and the phenomenon in that sense. Everyone's going to gravitate towards who they like better, or a subject matter they like better. But in totality, coming away from one of those conferences, and this all too well, as I'm sure many of your audience does as well, Kat, that have attended UFO conferences over the years, you get different perspectives, different subsets of the information, the data that's presented to you. And as I like to say, everyone has to kind of then go home and mentally decompress and figure out, okay, how do I assimilate all this information?
Because there's volumes of information.
There is. And
it's so diverse.
And what I'm going to be doing this year is, since I can't bring everyone to the archive, I'm trying to bring the archive to them. And this is not hyperbole. This is not sensationalism when I say this. I'm going to be presenting case files that have never been seen by the general public, going back as far as 1950. And these are case files that have been in the NICAP case file collection, the CUFOS case file collection. And as Barry Greenwood, my friend and colleague, confirmed, I said, I've gone through all the case files from 1947 to 1977, and there's a reason I stuck within that framework. And I've gone through every page of case file, news clippings, etc., government documents, and I've pulled every triangular UFO report I could find. And the reason I do that, and for those that have read my book, I make the argument that, many people falsely make statements online and elsewhere that these triangular UFOs are relatively new to the UFO field. And then many people use that as a springboard for the next false conclusion. Therefore, they must all be military.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm going to show you contemporaneous reports from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, clearly showing triangular UFOs have been around. Not only triangular UFOs, but ones that exhibit the exact same characteristics in flight dynamics and lighting patterns as I outlined in my book, looking at the historical data that I had at that time.
I was so excited when I read that, because I have friends who are abductees, and several were in the triangular UFOs.
Yes.
It's astounding how from missing time to, having implants turn up to one of the abductees of two just can't survive well with what happened.
Right.
It's such a phenomenon, just human interaction with those.
Yes.
No, and that has been going on for decades.
It has. And one element I don't touch on is the abduction phenomenon, but that's not for lack of interest or in refuting the abduction phenomenon. But what I'm looking at, and I've had to correct people on this too, because they say, well, Marler never referenced abductions regarding triangular UFOs. It's like, well, Marler was looking at newspapers and government documents and things back from the 40s, 50s, 60s. We weren't talking about abductions widely back then. And certainly in newspapers, they weren't talking about it, mainstream newspapers, but they were chronicling the sightings of these objects. And so I could only go based on the data that existed at the time.
Yes.
But certainly since writing my book, I've had numerous people contact me with experiences that they've had on board or otherwise with, for lack of a better term, aliens, non-human entities that were in conjunction with triangular UFOs. Now, the one thing I like to point out, though, is in the 1970s and 1980s, we did see a massive increase in sightings. And that could lend to the fact that some triangular aircraft that are being seen are being reported as triangular UFOs. I'm not saying that the military doesn't have triangular aircraft that are mistaken for triangular UFOs. As with everything in the UFO field, I think you'll agree, Kat, it's never a simple answer. It's never just one answer. We're probably dealing with a number of different variables.
Yes, I would say that's an easily verifiable statement. But, something that I want to touch base on when we come back from our break is that topic, because your book, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation, is just a fantastic analysis. I am not all the way through, but I know I have a friend, and actually in chat, who has seen them that were different from the average reported type of triangular shaped objects.
Yes.
And I wanted to discuss that with you as well.
Great.
But people tend to forget that there's a lot of information out there, and it's not something, I think the abductions are sensationalism to a degree, but it's such a personal experience for the abductees. It's something that should be treated respectfully and calmly. And that's why when you have contactee discussions at events, they are isolated so that their privacy is observed, care is shown to them, because what they've gone through is not what the average person experiences. I don't believe.
No, it's a transformative experience, and
yes.
One that most of us can maybe sympathize with, but few of us, and I'm referencing general public, can truly empathize unless we've had a similar experience.
Yes. And that's why it matters how that's handled. So I have to say that I have seen that with every con that included the UFO topic. I've seen care and consideration for abductees and an opportunity to share their experience and maybe find out that they're not alone.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that's so important. I really admire the people who work with them through these discussions, and I just admire people that are brave enough to say, this happened to me and I don't know what to do with it.
Right.
So
completely agree.
And it is a neat thing, but the the side that you do is just so important, because it's what gets the conversation moving. And then there's more support can come, more understanding can come, and these people do get an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I have an interesting story I'll share after our break.
Yay! I love interesting stories. But it is time for our top of the hour break. This is a news break, and as I am always saying, I'm always looking for a little good news, right? I want to acknowledge that out of all of the people who are covering the Ukrainian-Russian war, basically it's a one-sided attack at this point, but the Ukrainians are a brave and powerful people, and everyone, I believe, is cheering them on. But we lost an American journalist today, and they're supposed to be protected. So rules of engagement should be observed, as well as atrocities not allowed. We'll be back after this news break, and thanks so much for being here, and come back because David has so much more to share with us. See you on the flip side.
Live from NPR News, I'm Janine Herbst. 35 people are dead, another 134 wounded in a Russian strike on a Ukrainian base near the border with Poland. Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemned the attack, tweeting, "The brutality must stop." As NPR's Joe Hernandez reports, the military operation was a shocking signal that the front line of the war is moving farther west.
Local authorities in Lviv say the bombing hit the International Center for Peacekeeping and Security, just miles from Poland, a NATO member. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby says Russian strikes are expanding westward.
This is the third now military facility or airfield that the Russians have struck in western Ukraine in just the last couple of days. So clearly, at least from an airstrike perspective, they're broadening their target sets.
Kirby was speaking on ABC's This Week. The base has hosted foreign military advisors in the past, including from the U.S. Joe Hernandez, NPR News.
Another night of Russian bombardment in Ukraine has damaged a major Russian Orthodox holy site in the eastern part of the country. NPR's Julian Haddad reports that hundreds of refugees have been sheltering at the monastery in recent weeks.
The Holy Mountain Monastery in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast is one of the three most important institutions run by the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. According to Ukraine's culture ministry, a Russian rocket hit a nearby bridge after evening services had just concluded on late Saturday. In a video posted to YouTube, Archbishop Arseny, the monastery's abbot, said the shock waves blew out all of the windows and knocked sacred items onto the floor. He called on civilians in other parts of Ukraine to take in the 520 refugees who'd been sheltering in the monastery's basement, but he stopped short of blaming Russia for the attack. Julian Haida, NPR News, Lviv, Ukraine.
The NATO Secretary General is warning that Russia may be planning to use chemical weapons as it ramps up its military offensive in Ukraine. Terry Schultz reports Jens Stoltenberg says any such action would be considered a war crime.
NATO Chief Stoltenberg says the Russian government is creating false pretexts, quote, in an attempt to justify what cannot be justified. In an interview with the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag, Stoltenberg says Moscow is spreading what he calls absurd claims that Ukraine has laboratories to manufacture chemical and biological weapons. He says it's possible that Russia itself plans to use such fabrications to launch its own chemical weapons attacks, banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention to which Moscow is a party. Stoltenberg says he fears the coming days will bring even greater hardship to the Ukrainian people, calling on Russian President Vladimir Putin to, quote, end this war, withdraw all forces, and commit to diplomacy. He reiterates that NATO has no plans to intervene. For NPR News, I'm Terry Schultz in Brussels.
U.S. futures contracts are trading higher at this hour. Dow futures are up about 0.4%. You're listening to NPR News. In northern Italy, a bus carrying dozens of Ukrainian refugees overturned on a highway, leaving one person dead and several others injured. Italy's Interior Ministry says the bus was heading to a port city.
When things break, you look all over to find the problem. Is it the code?
The cause of the accident is under investigation.
The infrastructure.
A bill that is widely seen as a way to limit thoughtful...
Stop guessing.
Discussions about race in West Virginia's classrooms failed in the final moments of the West Virginia legislative session last night. West Virginia Public Broadcasting Liz McCormick has more.
State lawmakers waited until seconds before the constitutional deadline to take up Senate Bill 498. Within the hour, it was confirmed it had not made it in time. If passed, the bill would have prohibited a teacher in K-12 or higher education from teaching that one race is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. Opponents argued the bill would have created a chilling effect in the classroom, keeping teachers from teaching history accurately. It was also seen as a response to fears of critical race theory. West Virginia's bill was similar to dozens of other bills introduced in other Republican-led states this year. For NPR News, I'm Liz McCormick in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
And U.S. futures contracts are trading higher at this hour. Dow futures and the NASDAQ futures contracts are both trading ahead by about 0.4%. I'm Janine Herbst, and you're listening to NPR News.
Life Kit is like your friend with really good advice.
So, can I really be truthful?
Yeah.
It's just me and you, right?
Well, sure. Let's say it is.
3 times a week, Life Kit is in your feeds with episodes on health, personal finance, personal growth, and so much more. Listen to Life Kit from NPR.
Welcome back to WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. The time is 5 minutes after the hour. Welcome back for the second hour of Fate Mag Radio, the online voice of Fate Magazine. I am so pleased that you are here. If you missed the first half, don't worry. We are available in archive anywhere that you get your streaming. We're available on iHeart, Google, iTunes, Spotify, and if you are really interested in listening to us, we have a large following in India, and they use Savan. So I'm very appreciative of that, and I was made aware of it unexpectedly when somebody emailed me. So there you go. Tonight I am having a great time. My guest is David Marler, and I would strongly suggest that you check his website out. It is davidmarlerufo.com. He has one of the most extensive archives of journals, magazines, military reports, you name it. Oh, audio archives on the UFO topic that there are. It is phenomenal. He is sharing on his website. The audio files alone will keep you busy for days. It is such a rabbit hole. And I love that, right? So, David, I am so glad to have you here, and I have enjoyed every minute thus far, and I don't think that's going to change.
No, like I said, I'm enjoying the dialogue as well, Kat. And you were, at the end of the first hour, you were touching on the researchers working with these abductees and experiencers and, you know, how it really has helped them. And I wanted to mention, kind of related to that or a sideline to that, when I first published my book back in 2013, I never wrote a book, never thought about writing a book, but it all came about as a result of lecturing at the 2012 Ozark Mountain UFO Conference. And I had 4 or 5 people come up to me after a lecture. Now, mind you, I'd been lecturing on the triangular UFO subject going back to 2000. But for whatever reason, that year, it really resonated. And I had people coming up saying, I want to buy a copy of your book. And I laughed because I didn't say I was writing a book. I didn't reference a book during my lecture. They just naturally assumed I had a book. And then I met John Alexander, who's now a good friend and colleague. And he came over. We had met actually at that conference, and he came over and at the end of my presentation and walked across the hall, stuck his hand out, shook my hand, says, I just want to tell you, it's one of the best UFO lectures I've heard at one of these conferences in many, many years. And then that just really led to an appreciation of the subject and then an ultimate friendship with John. And fast forward 10 years later, now we're going to both be keynote speakers at the Ozark Mountain Conference. So I'm really looking forward to it. But in writing the book, when I finally did decide to write a book based on all of that interest, I had the naive idea that I want to get the information out there. And by information, it's what I alluded to earlier, that I was seeing people post online, well, these triangles are new. And they're saying that, but I'm looking at the actual case files that I've acquired and the documents, government documents and newspaper archives that clearly showed that these things were being reported in the 1950s and 60s, if not earlier. And so I felt like I needed to set the historical record straight. You know, these people are making statements that are, you know, bold-faced erroneous. I mean, here's the information, contemporaneous reports that contradict that idea. But what I wasn't expecting was the number of people that were reaching out to me. And the one that I was going to share with you and your audience, the very first person to reach out to me, and we're still in touch off and on today, her first name, I won't give her last name, is Judy. And Judy reached out from Pennsylvania. And it was an initially an email, as quite often we start off with these conversations. And it ultimately led to a number of phone calls. But Judy, by the time we got to the phone call, was in tears, in a good way. She was telling me, and it echoed what she had already shared in emails to me. She said, your book was validation for me. I told my husband what I saw back in the 1980s, and she, of course, witnessed a triangular UFO. I told my friends, and I told some coworkers of mine, and nobody would believe me, or they would laugh at me, or they would just be dismissive. And it's like, I knew I saw what I saw. And there was another woman with me that was a witness as well. And she said, but when I stumbled across your book and I got your book and I saw this history of other people seeing and describing virtually identically what I described and what I saw, it gave me validation. And I was able to show people, look, other people have seen these things. And so when you were mentioning about the abductions and helping support them, it's in a weird way, without knowing it, in writing this book, it has served as validation. And I've had other people echo that, but certainly Judy was the first one to reach out and was one of the more emotional. But I had no idea that it would touch a nerve like that, as it did.
Well, I am glad that you were available for her to reach out to. You know, someone that I admire a lot was involved in a sighting of one when they were doing a field investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because it was a group of field investigators, very experienced, very boots on the ground people. And to a person, they saw it and they all ran. They didn't even talk about it. They just ran for the truck, and still wound up having missing time. Which was one of their worst nightmares.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was very aware of that when I saw the title of your book, which, by the way, I haven't even mentioned that, but it is Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. And you cover just about every aspect. One of the things that I was surprised by, we have a woman in chat who said, she lives in Ohio, she says, Wright Patterson has always been in the UFO study. She saw 3 white triangle-shaped objects flying around the town of, I'm not going to get this right, Wapakoneta, which is right near Wright Pat.
Okay.
And I always have heard of, you know, my friends who have been abducted in them, who have had sightings. You know, they're always huge.
Mm-hmm.
They always have the lights, which are on point with what's described in your book and have not changed over the decades.
Right.
And they're black.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of white triangular UFOs?
I'm sitting here looking at a news clipping right now, which is actually the first in the historical cases I'll be reviewing in my lecture. And this was from a newspaper. It doesn't cite which newspaper, unfortunately. A lot of these that I receive in scrapbooks, sometimes they trim the header off, so I don't have the date. But I did verify it through other news sources. The title of the article is Flying Triangles, Newest in Stories of Mystery Discs. And this was in 1950. Wow. And it was a pilot and a friend flying in a private plane over north central California. And while they were flying, it describes that they looked down and saw two white triangular objects flying side by side. They had black along the leading edges and on the tips of the wing. And they described how these objects moved. They were able to rapidly accelerate. And this is one I shared with Chris Mellon. And Chris even said, he goes, I don't remember ever hearing of white ones. I said, yes, but how many cases do you have where someone's above the triangles looking down? Exactly. And he looked at me and smiled in typical Chris fashion. He goes, good point. So, but no, Kat, to your point, one of the things I'm going to be focusing on is the fact that we do have this stereotypical kind of iconic image of the triangular UFOs, like you said, large in size, dark or black, large white lights at each point. And we're going to see that in going through the history of these reports. But you are also going to see variations, variability in the reports, and not only the historical reports, the ones that I've received subsequent to some of the media coverage I've had over the last couple of years. There are variations in the triangles, and I'm going to go through and outline those details as I did in my book. For example, one of the characteristics I outline in my book, just for your audience, if they're not familiar with the work, some of these objects have complete absence of lighting. In other words, the witness had a second like sensation or like a strange sensation that suddenly they just felt compelled to look up, and above them in a moonlit sky, they could see a dark, silent triangle floating overhead. They could clearly see the outline of it because, again, the moon was illuminating the sky at night and the stars, but this object was blocking out the stars and it was moving silently. Complete absence of lighting. Other ones display the underside of the triangle bathed in a variation of colored glowing light. There's one that I talk about from the 1960s that occurred in Florida, and the gentleman was out hunting. And he, again, one of those things where he just instinctively looked up and there was no noise. What he observed was a dark pink, and I'll be sharing this in my lecture this year, a dark pink diamond-shaped UFO. He's watching it as it's almost hovering right above him, moving very slowly, but almost at a virtual standstill. And then he notices that the diamond separates into two triangles. The one triangle then moves over to the side of the other triangle. So you have two basic triangles, one sitting next to the other. He noted that when the objects separated from a diamond into two triangles, the color changed, which is, I think, an interesting characteristic because this might be indicative of energy output, perhaps, with propulsion. It went from a dull pink color to a bright red glow. In other words, it went from a dull gray, pinkish diamond to two glowing red triangles. And the one, as I mentioned, maneuvered side by side with the other one, and then they moved off together. And this is a characteristic I've seen before, where we've had diamond-shaped UFOs sighted with triangles, and I've speculated previously that could these be triangles that are somehow flying together and then separate, and then lo and behold, I find this case report, which I'll be talking about, where the witness not only described it but sketched the objects and showed how they separated. And so that's an unusual characteristic. And then some of these triangles have been seen to change shape right before the eyes of the individual. So again, if we're dealing with some type of physics, it must be some physics beyond what we understand today, because, you know, even though, yes, they do seem to have solidity at times, at other times they seem to be mutable, changeable right before the witness. In fact, another pilot sighting, which I'll be touching on, I believe from the 1960s, occurred in Florida. And he described this immense, and again, white triangle that came over he was flying a private plane similar to a Cessna. It came directly over his plane while he's flying. It literally was just dwarfing his plane. And he then saw it change shape into more of a cone-shaped object. But then the cone changed back into an equilateral triangle, and he saw the triangle then bank and maneuver and disappear. But he described the size of it, similar to what you referenced, Kat. He said it was large enough I could have landed my plane on it.
That is fascinating. You know, I am just so overwhelmed by the versatility of these craft. We are definitely behind the game here.
Well, and again, these cases are contemporaneous reports, and I say that for a reason. I've had people contact me and said, I saw a triangle back in 1972, and I certainly don't necessarily discount that, but it's more impactful when you pull out a report from these historic case files that shows you the date it was filed, that yes, the sighting was on January 28th, and the report is stamped and dated received at NICAP headquarters a month or two later. So it's not that I have to question it. It's like, no, here's the contemporaneous report documenting that sighting at that time. And it's most important to point this out. At a time when triangular UFOs weren't in vogue, weren't in style, if you were going to concoct a story, if you were, as skeptics often state, you watched a UFO show and then you went up and you looked up in the sky and you thought you saw a UFO. People back then would have been more inclined to see a 30-foot silver disc with a little dome on top. But even though that was the prevalent type of object being seen back then, we still have this undercurrent of consistent reporting of triangular UFOs. And in the 60s and in the 70s, we saw a huge uptick, as I'll outline in my lecture, where you see the cases, case after case after case, and how the 60s and the 70s, we really saw an increase in that, which flies in the face of some explanations that, people are just seeing F-117A stealth bombers or stealth fighters or B-2 stealth bombers. No, the contemporaneous reports, these eyewitness reports predate stealth technology by decades.
That is totally astounding to me. But we have to take a quick break, so let's do it, and we'll be right back.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, Birmingham, Alabama.
Paratalk Radio is your one-stop for all things paranormal, the unknown, and the supernatural. Join us every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central for discussions and guests on topics such as ghosts, hauntings, Bigfoot, UFOs, and more. This broadcast is rated M for mature and intended for listeners over 16 on paratalkradio.com.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but... Nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Thank you for listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
The time is 23 minutes after the hour. Welcome back to Fate Mag Radio, the online voice of Fate Magazine. I am Kat Hobson, your host, and I am joined by my guest, David Marler. And please do check out his website, davidmarlerufo.com, because you will find so much information. You'll find audio files, original recordings of UFO reports. You will find news, magazine articles. Well, actually, you had to take some of that stuff down, didn't you, David? Because people were trying to make money off of your research.
Yes, there was one situation with a researcher who has passed away just recently. I won't mention the name, but he had asked, and I use the term loosely, asked if he could use some of the material from my website. And I use the term loosely. He pretty much said, I'm incorporating some of your material into my new book. And I'm like, okay.
Holy cow, well, that's a bit bold.
And the way it was implied, I thought, well, if he's just taking a little segment or so, I'm not picky about that. I mean, the information's out there. But he quite literally took almost lock, stock, and barrel my entire report on the Farmington, New Mexico wave from 1950.
Oh my
and
word.
made an entire chapter out of it virtually in his book, and then pulled some other relevant information as well. And then I get the book after it's been printed, and I was a little irritated. I mean, I would have acquiesced. I would have said, yes, you can do it, but I would have appreciated asking first. And I found out that really the entire book was a pirated collection of other people's research that he pulled off the internet and put together. And so, once bitten, twice shy, I just decided, well, I will share it with individuals on an as needed basis or as requested basis, but I'm not just going to spend my time and money and effort to research these things so someone else can publish a book using it.
Absolutely not. I would have an issue with not being asked as well.
Yes, I was a little irritated, but again, I thought it was just a small segment. And then when I saw the book, in fact, another friend and author called me. He goes, "Did you get this book?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he was thinking about actually pursuing legal action, which again, the researcher did pass away since it was published. And obviously nothing's going to come of that, but it's one of those lessons you learn. Some people just don't play by the same set of rules that I like to play by.
Well, and when that shows, it's always remembered.
Yes, absolutely. And but no, I still share my information with everyone else, and with, like I said, interested parties. In fact, the lecture that I'll be giving on these historical case files that have not been seen by the public, I'm going to preface that we only have an hour and a half to 2 hours to cover all of it. So I'm going to just touch on some of these cases, but the point is to show you the patterns and the data that exist. And I do have as one of my early slides in my lecture that for anyone that might be interested in a case because maybe you live near there, or it's very similar to a report you have or similar to a sighting you've had, if you ask me for the entire case file, I'll send you the entire case file on any one of these. But in the interest of time and for lecture purposes, I can only touch on so much with each one.
Right. Well, I know I'm so excited to be there and listening to this. So we have another question in chat, and I did not ask you this. Well, I was actually planning to, but we had so much other stuff we were talking about. But have you personally had any UFO experiences? Have you had a reason to be quite so involved other than that you just love research?
I would love to tell you I had a dramatic UFO sighting of my own, as I know many UFO researchers have. Unfortunately, I haven't had that pleasure. My interest just got started by hearing about UFOs in the 70s growing up. And it just continued to grow. My sister had a close encounter with a UFO outside Kansas City, Missouri, where literally it sounds cliche, but it was the close encounter scene with the spotlight hovering, shot down around the car, illuminating everything around it. with her and her husband, and they never saw publicity. They only shared it with friends and family about the incident, but I heard about that in 1977. And just a number of different areas of UFO activity that occurred around St. Louis, Missouri, where I kind of grew up in the St. Louis area. And so it was just gradual exposure, I guess you could say, to the narratives, to the subject matter that just solidified my interest over time. And then my father really initially started my interest in the subject, and I dedicated the book to his memory because of that.
That's so neat.
I've seen lights that moved in unusual manners. But as I always say, for me, as a pretty hardcore researcher, for me to say I saw a UFO, I need to see a structured object behaving in an unusual way. The only thing I've seen are very unusual lights that move in nonlinear motion, if that makes any sense. Yes. And they were all very high altitude, so nothing like a quote unquote close encounter that I could speak to. But that's not for lack of trying. In my early days, from 1990 to about 2000. I was doing exhaustive field work, mainly in Missouri, the state of Missouri, where they were having a lot of UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, abductions, and this primarily centered around Springfield, Missouri at that time, which even today there's still ongoing activity. And so there were many, many nights, hundreds of hours spent where I'm in a field where there was a UFO sighting the weekend before, there was a cattle mutilated in the field next to me. And myself and other investigators were set up with infrared cameras, with infrared film, back then the old VHS camcorders, night vision gear, and parabolic recording microphones to record any noises. And unfortunately, after hundreds of hours of doing that, I had zero to show for it. And then over that time period, I started collecting a lot of historical material, and then it has just developed into this burgeoning library that I now have. And so based on the information that I had, I decided to then start focusing not so much with in-field work, but doing the historical research and comparing cases and looking at patterns in the data. And then that led to lecturing, and people seem to respond well to the lectures that I've given over the years. And so I think I found, like I said, my niche now, kind of focusing on the historical, again, to provide context for what's being seen today. We're not just talking about things that happened past tense. Triangles are still being seen today. Other types of UFOs that I've lectured about are still being seen. So I simply see it as providing context for what many investigators in the field are investigating today, cases from yesterday or last week. I think we have to view the totality of evidence and information. And like I say, all of these cases, whether they're in newspaper articles from 1955 or a NICAP report form from 1973, or a personal friend that you and I know that interviewed a witness just last week about a sighting that occurred, they're data points. They're all data points that need to go together, and we need to start really examining the data to see what are the patterns, what are the consistencies, are there correlations with location, time, etc., that seem to be common with many of these reports. And like I say, I don't have any grandiose ideas that Marler is going to crack the UFO mystery wide open any more than I think anyone is, but patterns may give us insights. Insights may be a stepping stone towards eventual understanding of the phenomenon. So, it's baby steps, like any research field, whether it's, cancer research, whether it's studying weather patterns. I don't think there's ever going to be the aha moment, the smoking gun event or case where it just blows everything wide open and now we have an understanding of the UFO mystery. It's going to be through systemic, objective analysis, investigation, and research, and taking that cumulative body of information regarding the UFO subject and starting to glean those insights, which again, hopefully will eventually lead to answers.
Well, that's where the diligence comes in.
That's research, right, Kat?
It is hurry up and wait all the way through.
Yes, I've learned patience in this process, by the way.
Oh, well, I hope you didn't pray for it. Because it just keeps coming if you do.
Yes,
opportunities to develop it.
Absolutely.
But, something that I'm curious about. I do know that triangles are your bag, but you have so much knowledge of other structured craft.
Yeah.
I have a friend who has experienced like a square.
Oh, yes.
A cube. And
yes.
It looks like it's multi-story. Yeah, it's tall.
Mm-hmm.
You're not surprised by that at all.
No, in doing my comprehensive review over the last calendar year, quite literally, it took me a year to go through all of these case files from 47 to 77. There were not many. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but I found at least, I think, 3 or 4. They call them cube or box. You know, there's different descriptives, just like with the triangles. But there were a number of rectangular UFOs also, which I guess technically could fall into that quote unquote box category. Yes. And in fact, in Springfield, Missouri, there was a sighting of a rectangle that was reported and graphically represented by a professional artist that I know and that I worked with on those investigations there. Yes, there have been cubes reported. Absolutely. Again, a much smaller subset, just like triangles back in the day were a much smaller subset relative to the flying discs or flying saucers back in the day. But there's a wide variety of reports, and certainly boxes and cubes fall into one of those categories.
Well, it was very interesting to me when it was being shared that the experiencers, there were observers on a ridge, and 2 of their personnel were actually down where this craft was hovering.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost the heat signature of the people on the ground near it. They just disappeared.
And
a couple of minutes later, as everybody's trying to figure out what in the world. See, if you're a UFO researcher, you need to talk about this stuff with your friends, because there was not a plan in place to go and do a rescue operation on a UFO.
Right.
So, so when their friends, colleagues disappeared from anything that they were using to monitor them, and they all are monitored, there was, to be the level of personnel that these were, I would say it was panic. They would not. But there was consternation at the very least. And as they're getting ready to implement any kind of plan, the people reappeared.
And did the 2 individuals who disappeared, did they have any ill effects?
Not that I'm aware of. And not that they were aware of at that time.
Well, that's good. Well, yeah, that's reassuring.
Well, it is, because it's like when I spoke with Travis Walton, and he felt that he was actually rescued in his abduction experience because of the wash from whatever propellant that was.
Right.
There wasn't something so dramatic here, but I'm sure the physicals were done after the fact and things of that nature. But these were people that have planned this. They have investigated together for a very long time. The activity that they have experienced is similar to that which is televised, right?
Yeah.
On a couple of different shows now.
Sure.
And these are professional people. They're trained observers.
It sounds like they're very seasoned investigators, which, to your point, this goes beyond, the idea that this is just an average citizen that doesn't have any background knowledge. So that's very intriguing, because obviously they're going to be trained and tuned in to look for more details than the average person in a situation like that. Even though, admittedly, like emergency training, you can train and train and train, but until you're in a situation like that, you truly don't know how you're going to react.
Yes, and they had not. This was one instance that they had not anticipated. And now there's a plan. But, I was just curious if that was a common theme with that particular craft, because, abductions are generally tied to triangles or to a large part. Yeah. It's just fascinating to me that different craft behave in different manners. What do you think?
Yeah, no, there's differences, and yet sometimes there's similarities. Many of these different types of objects. In fact, just if I can compare and contrast the triangles to like discs, for example, the vast majority of discs are silent, and the vast majority of triangles are silent. But at the same time, we have had close encounter sightings with both types, where people do hear a buzzing or a humming or a whirring or a ultra low frequency sound / vibration. And so, it's quite possible, despite the fact we're perceiving these things as different shapes, and quite possibly they are, the underpinnings, the physics, the propulsion technology might be very similar. And this may be a terrible analogy, but I've thrown it out there before. I've had people say to me with quite solid confidence, well, we know the Greys are flying the flying saucers, and the reptilians are flying the triangles. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, well, first off, I don't know that, so I don't know what inside knowledge you have. But I think it's somewhat arbitrary to kind of relegate those things so simplistically. That would be the equivalent of standing near an interstate and saying, only Catholics drive Fords. we know that Catholics drive all kinds of cars, just like our Jewish friends do and our Islamic friends do. So I kind of find that kind of very rudimentary way of looking at things. I've always kind of liked to think of it like the UFOs that we're seeing are probably created and built based on the utilization. In other words, whatever mission that they are serving, that's how they're structured. And I say that because we could see a gentleman driving a pickup truck, but he's going to a work site where he then is going to get into a backhoe, a construction piece of equipment, a backhoe, to dig a hole. And then he might go over to a wrecking ball machine because he needs to knock down a wall to a building that they're clearing out. So I've always kind of approached it that way. Again, in talking to some people within the military, that we don't just build aircraft to build aircraft. They're purpose built. Yes. If you want a long range bomber, then we're going to design a long range bomber. But there's usually a purpose in mind. And if we're dealing with an intelligence, which I think clearly we are, I mean, these aren't just little fireflies at night that people are reporting, then there has to be intelligence. And I would think in line with that intelligence, there's design and there's intent, and the objects that we're seeing are a result or the end product of what they're trying to design or intend to do.
It's just fascinating.
But again, I could be completely wrong. I always throw out the caveat. But again, Marler could be completely wrong.
But it sounded really good.
Well,
so we'll go with that.
The only thing we can use as a corollary with the quote unquote aliens, and again, I don't have any inside knowledge of aliens. I've not met one. I've not had experiences like that. The only analogy we can use is looking at how we behave and how we do things. And so I think it's at least a starting point to consider that as a possibility, without going down other avenues or conspiracy theories, etc. But I think that, if this is technology, there's intent behind utilizing the technology, and the design is probably representative of what they're trying to achieve or use these devices for.
It just is interesting to ponder that.
Well, and one I will throw out briefly is Chris Mellon during Unidentified. And by the way, I should preface this for your audience. Chris and I already knew each other prior to the History Channel's Unidentified, for anyone that may have caught that episode. About 2 years prior to that filming, and about a year prior to the first season of Unidentified, I got a call from a mutual friend in the UFO field, and he said, I was actually driving back from El Paso, Texas on a business trip. I remember it to this day. And he said, do you know Chris Mellon? And I laughed. I said, this is, again, before the History Channel, before Chris, really gained a lot of notoriety in the UFO field. And I said, well, I know of Chris Mellon. I've heard his name a few times. And he said, but I don't know him. He goes, well, he wants to know you. He called me saying, who should I talk to about triangles? And I said, it's got to be Dave Marler. He literally wrote the book on the subject. And so about 2 or 3 weeks later, after we compared our calendars, Chris and I had a chat, and I'm sitting in the chair where I sat and talked to him those years ago. And the very first thing Chris said, he goes, Dave, thank you for your time in speaking with me. I just want to tell you, when your book came out in 2013, I read it, and I'm a huge fan of your research. which, coming from a man of Chris Mellon's stature and position, I was rather humbled by that. I was like, okay, if Chris is respecting my work, then I must be doing something right. But that led to an 1.5-hour long conversation about how he had a personal fascination, not only with UFOs, but specifically the triangular UFOs. And so that was before Unidentified. And then when Unidentified came on and they were doing season 2, they were going to focus episodes on different subsets of data. And obviously between Chris and my interest in the subject, that's what led to the episode on triangles and talking about the triangular UFOs. But it was an interesting dialogue, being able to kind of converse with someone of Chris's stature and talk about the subject. And
without a doubt.
And so I like to say that because I know a lot of people watch television and a lot of it is scripted. I will tell you, at least my episode was not scripted in any way. In fact, I always tell my friends that when you see me meeting Chris for the first time on camera, I was quite literally meeting Chris for the first time on camera. We were in the research room filming the night before and on that Saturday morning. And I was told by the producer that Chris is going to join us. He's going to grab some coffee and he'll join us. And they're interviewing me on camera and shooting what we call B-roll, just images of the research room and the files. And finally, it got to be like 11:30. And I asked, her name was Danielle. I said, Danielle, I thought Chris was going to join us. She goes, oh, he is. He's actually driving around your neighborhood, but we don't want you to meet him because we want you to meet him on camera so it comes off as genuine. We truly want you to meet him on camera for the first time. And I was impressed with that. And I was impressed with the production as a whole because that they didn't choreograph or script anything. And so if you ever watch that again, or any of your audience watch that episode again, when I come out and say, Chris, it's nice to finally meet you, I was chomping at the bit to finally meet him because I'm sitting there waiting. And I'm like, when's Chris going to get here? I really want to talk to him. And so I just thought that, in this day of quote unquote reality television, I think it's important to point things like that out, that it was unscripted in that sense. I knew he was coming, but we didn't meet. And then when he comes into the research room also, you see him come in, and it is truly kind of shock and amazement because he hadn't seen the research room until he literally comes through that door when we were filming. So I thought that really spoke to the production group and the quality of the production, that they wanted it to be authentic and genuine.
Well, I would agree with that. I think that's actually very, very neat that they went to those, that he just went and drove around, went to those extremes to make that happen.
And he was driving around for a while. I think he was driving around my neighborhood for about an hour.
Oh my goodness. Well, I hope he had lots to look at. That's funny. But I'm going to go ahead and pop this last break in, and when we come back, we will answer any questions anyone may have and just enjoy the rest of this. We'll be right back, guys.
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but...
Nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experienced Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Welcome back to the final segment of Fate Mag Radio. I'm so glad you've been here. I hope you have enjoyed David Marler as much as I have. And I also hope that you're going to be at the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference to join us. And I have got to tell you, it is one of my favorite places to be. It's beautiful. It's not that easy to get to if you're driving, but it's dead easy if you're in a car. So, in a plane. But, and it has some of the best guests. Their lineup this year is just phenomenal. I am looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to meeting you and being able to have a cup of coffee and a conversation about even more of this topic.
Look forward to it.
Me too. Well, what would you like to leave people with? We've got 10 minutes, and I want it to be all about you and what you want to focus on.
Well, I'd like to just touch on a couple cases. I know I've been referencing these historic cases, but just a couple other ones that I'll be discussing in my lecture. And we were talking earlier, Kat, about the square and the rectangular UFOs. Mm-hmm. And admittedly, those things are as aerodynamic as a brick.
I would think so. I just couldn't visualize like that flying.
But something else that I often reference as aerodynamic as a brick is the fact that many of these modern triangular UFO accounts describe the triangle moving not with the point as the leading edge, as we would think with like the B-2 stealth bomber or a delta wing shaped jet. People describe quite often the flat side of the triangle as the leading edge and the point tapering to the back. I outlined that in my book with a number of historical cases, but in going through the historic NICAP files, not only did I find a report, this was from Pleasantville, Pennsylvania, November 10th, 1964, I was able to find the audio recording on an old reel-to-reel that was done by the investigator interviewing the witness. And so I'll not only show you the witness sketch, but you'll hear an excerpt from the witness 1964 describing it. And what he essentially draws is an isosceles triangle, and then he notes this broad flat edge, which he indicates in the sketch as the leading edge. In other words, it was moving with the flat side of the triangle, and he calls it broad edge forward movement. I call it blunt edge forward movement or blunt end forward movement in my book. But he describes that in the interview that people will hear, how strange it was that this sharp leading edge was leading, and then the triangle was kind of tapering to a point in the back. And it's just one of many examples of the unusual characteristics where clearly these aren't aircraft being misidentified when you have a report like that. And again, he even notes in the article that the object was completely silent, no sound whatsoever. And then another element that we'll touch on, there's a case from May 26, 1965. This is over in Washington, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. I found going through the newspaper archives and clippings in the NICAP case files, there's a report where the news clipping, the headline is "Triangular Soundless Craft Seen." And this triangular soundless object was seen flying over the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Now, it was cited by a military personnel, but what's interesting about that, in further research, in 1965, that same year, the shipyard began repairing nuclear-powered vessels. And we've heard about the UFO nuclear connection with weapons, with storage sites, with energy plants. I found it very interesting that that particular year is when they first started working on nuclear-powered vessels. And the first one was the USS Sculpin, which was a nuclear-powered submarine. But here we have nuclear submarines being serviced at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. In that same year, we have a triangular UFO flying directly overhead.
Oh, that's not a bit coincidental, right?
Well, and it's just one of many patterns that comes out of the data. And 65 was a pretty active year for triangular UFO reports. Another one that occurred literally 2 months after the Puget Sound incident, which I'll be touching on and you'll be seeing, occurred in Rochester, Minnesota. A young gentleman at 12:30 at night was working at a golf course and saw your stereotypical triangle, this triangular equilateral object with a point of light at each point, and it was hovering silently. And it also had erratic maneuvers that he described. We have a copy of the police report that he filed with local police because he called them out. And we also have, again, in this case, a reel-to-reel interview audio recording with the witness. So you'll be able not to hear it in my voice. I'll let the witnesses in some of these cases speak for themselves.
I love that. I love that you do that. Well, I can't wait for that.
Well, and this is the data that I have. Again, I wrote my book based on the data set available at the time in 2012 and 2013. This is a whole new data set. Again, we won't cover all of them, but I found 102 additional reports in the NICAP case files from 47 to 77. I'm happy to say, before I forget, I mentioned my friend in the UK, Philip Mantle. Philip, over the course of probably the next 2 to 3 months, will be shipping out an entire pallet of UFO history and data and case files. It's his personal case file collection and information he's collected over a 40 to 50 year period. And he is sending all of his files to be housed here at the research center for researchers to use. And all of this material will eventually wind up at the University of New Mexico, where I've lectured on the subject of UFOs to the university. And they are willingly wanting to accept this historical information because, admittedly, Kat, I'm not going to be here forever, just like researchers before me. And unlike the other collections we talked about that wound up in the trash, this information, all of it, will eventually reside at the University of New Mexico in the Southwest Special Collections, where the general public and researchers can come and access the material 40, 50, 60 years from now.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I knew Philip was going to be getting his research out to someone who would be able to take care of it as archives. I did not know it was you. So, yes. Until just now.
And I will tell you, Kat, I was as surprised as you. Philip
I'm not surprised that it is you, but I was
he literally know. He dumped this on me one day. We do Skype calls. We talk on a regular basis. We exchange emails. And quite literally one day he told me, David, he goes, I've been thinking and I want you to have this material because I know you're going to take care of it. You're going to make it accessible to researchers and it'll eventually go to UNM where it'll have a permanent home. I was completely blown away. We never even hinted or discussed the subject. He voluntarily brought it up and dumped that on my lap. So the point is, with that data that I'll be acquiring later this year, who knows what other triangular UFO or other case files and information might be in there.
Well, his files are extensive.
Extensive.
That is going to be fabulous.
So stay tuned is all I can say. I always say this is not a static collection. It's constantly growing, and it's case files. It's more data points. And again, the more information we have, I think the better. And the more sets of eyes and brains that we apply to the information for researchers that come here or that request information. I fulfill regular requests for case files, audio recordings, and information. And if I can help other researchers with this data by sharing it, then I think we're going to be better as a whole.
I agree. Thank you so much for your time. I have had the best time with this conversation.
The fastest 2 hours, right, Kat?
It is. It is. And, for your willingness to answer, my sometimes unusual questions. My mind does not run along the same path as most people, I don't think.
Well, but I hope I see you, and I hope I see some of your audience members at the Ozark Mountain Conference next month.
Oh, I'm positive you will. We have a lot of people who listen who enjoy that particular one. And it's always fun, right, to get to see them and interact and have a great time.
Especially after a 2-year hiatus. And we're really looking forward to meeting people and seeing people again.
I know, right? So, well, definitely. I'm looking forward to that also. I am going to enjoy your lecture. But For everyone listening, thank you so much. We have had a lot of information. We have had some great conversation and questions. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. And we will be back tomorrow night, actually, Paranormal Pride with Denise Pridemore. Wednesday is Paranormal Experienced with me. Thursday is Universal Truths with Mark Faust. And then we'll be back with Ghost Talk Radio on Friday. And then it will be back to Fate. So, have a great week. Be sure to be the person that you want to see. Be that change. We need some of that in the world today. And I'm doing my best. I know y'all are too. Let's just support each other in that. And I hope that you just have a fantastic week going forward. I appreciate every one of you. You're the reason we do these shows. So, see you next week. Same cat time.